Okay.
All right, welcome back to the Vijñapti podcast. I'm joined here today by Nick Haight, a friend of mine and a Buddhist scholar. Nick, it's good to have you back.
Thanks for having me back. I'm happy to be on yet again. It's always a good time.
Yeah, definitely. I'll actually make it a podcast one of these days. My girlfriend pointed out to me, it's not really a podcast if I can't have it on like Spotify or something. So I'll get the audio set up so that I can do that. She's just messing around.
Oh, of
But
course,
I
yeah.
I do want to have yeah. But I do want to have it, able to view in that format. Um but yeah, let's get started. Okay, so I wanted to do a little game with you, just, break the ice again. If you could meet any if you could meet one fictional, well, maybe not fictional, if you could meet one mythological figure within Buddhist cosmology, and then if you could meet one historical figure within Buddhist cosmology, who would you like to meet?
The one that is mythical that I would like to meet is Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha, the Buddha who's at the center of Shingon Buddhism, esoteric Buddhism. And if I could meet one historical figure, then it would either be Kukai or it would be Nagarjuna, the middle way Madhyamaka thinker from India way back when.
Gotcha. Nice. That's really cool. I think I would have to um go with you there for the historical Kukai. I would definitely want to meet him. He just seems like a very interesting guy, and I feel like I can relate to his thinking in a lot of ways. So cool. Thanks for kind of giving that. We'll look very forward to talking with you more about Shingon in the future. Um, but for now, I wanted to, we'll be diving into Thompson's book today. So this is the third part in a series on a book review called Why I Am Not a Buddhist by Evan Thompson. And today we are on chapter three. I think it's called Self or Non-Self. Let me get my book.
It's got a fun title. It's actually called Not Self, Not So Fast.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, I think Thompson's got a good sense of humor
He
um,
does, yeah.
throughout the book. So cool. Yeah, it's just to give a little bit of context, this is Thompson is writing this book primarily as a response to Buddhist modernism and Buddhist exceptionalism, and he's basically pointing out why these ideas are problematic. So that's his main focus for this book. Um, Within that, he in this chapter specifically, he's pointing out a lot of the reasons why this Buddhist modernist conception of, oh, science proves that the Buddhist idea of non-self is correct because and then he goes out to outline his own arguments why for that. But I wanted to start more basically at the historical development of this idea over time, specifically in relation to its historical development, um, kind of as a response to the Vedic Brahminical traditions of India. So yeah, you have a lot more knowledge here than I do. So could you give like a brief historical analysis of these ideas here?
Absolutely, yeah. So for those who are reading along with us, he gets into this conversation about interpretations of non-self among Vedic Brahminical thinkers and also disciples of the Buddha on page 93 through like 95, 96. And I'm not an expert on Vedic Brahminical Indian philosophy myself, but I can understand what he is getting at and what he's speaking to when he talks about the three different interpretations that people have of the non-self teaching during the life of the Buddha and after he dies. And
Right.
these three interpretations come to develop into their own schools and their own sort of sects, you might say. And interestingly, they're all lost to history. So there are very few people who are still affiliated with the schools that these interpretations are part of. So the first interpretation that he poses is the idea of pure consciousness. So
Mhm.
there is this idea that because the self is not in the aggregates, it's not in the body, etc., then the Alaya Vijnana, or maybe a shared piece of consciousness between all humanity or all sentient beings, maybe that is the pure element, the karmically pure, morally pure element, and that's where the quote unquote self is. Evan Thompson's right to knock this down. This view is just purely incorrect based on the sermons. This is the Buddha is recorded as having directly spoken to this interpretation and saying this interpretation is wrong.
Right.
So I mentioned this issue of the self and the aggregates. Um,
I'm sorry. Could So I think maybe my audience might not be as up to par with yours in terms of Buddhism. Just basically, I wanted to clarify a few things and get your
Absolutely.
response. Yeah, thank you. So from my understanding, this idea of non-self evolves largely, or if not directly, as a response to the Brahminical view of self.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk a bit and kind of break those down very basically? What is entailed in this notion of self and non-self when it comes to comparing um, these two different versions? How would you kind of break those down at a very basic level?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I probably should have started with that.
Oh, no, no
So,
worries.
yeah,
Yeah.
so in these Vedic Brahminical traditions, there is this belief that there is an ultimate and universal reality, and that ultimate universal reality is called Brahman,
Mm,
Brahman. And the purpose of our existence, of our lives, is to practice meditation and asceticism and to fulfill our dharma based on our position in the cosmology, our social class, our
mm,
age, and so on. And by sort of fulfilling this, you can realize your own oneness with this ultimate universal reality.
mm,
The reason why this is possible is because we all have, according to them, a piece of this reality in ourselves. And that piece is everlasting, unchanging, it's unstained, it's morally pure, and it just needs to be uncovered and realized. It needs to be brought to the fore by all of this exertion. And that piece is called Atman, Atman. And
okay,
so this is often conflated in the Western imagination nowadays with a soul. A soul is a very Christian idea. A soul is the thing that is you, that never changes and that exists forever and either goes to heaven or hell whenever you die. And Atman
sure.
is not quite the same, but it's close enough that thinking of it like a soul is useful. The Buddha responds to this by saying there is no such thing as this Atman. We don't have some piece of ourselves that is permanent and unchanging and substantial in this way. Nothing exists in such a real way.
Mhm.
So instead, he posits the concept of anatman. In Sanskrit, the prefix a or an is the same as in English. It's a negative. So just like you might say a religious, he says anatman, right? So
Sure.
anatman is the absence of this sort of Brahmanical self, this Brahmanical soul, this piece of ultimate reality.
I see.
And the reason why we don't have that is because impermanence is just too much. It's too universal, so to speak.
I see.
There's no impermanence simply doesn't work as, in a situation where there is such a thing as this Atman or a soul. And conversely, a soul or a self or an Atman doesn't work if impermanence is true.
Sure.
And all of the Buddhas and all of our sort of observable reality, all of the evidence that we have points to impermanence and our desire for its opposite. So he's critiquing the Brahmanical traditions as saying, as being too desirous of something that lasts forever. And he's saying there is no such thing. And desiring for all that is the reason why a lot of people are in a state of being mentally, emotionally, even sometimes physically unwell. That's sort of the definition of dukkha, is because we desire for this permanence and no such thing exists. And that discrepancy is upsetting to us. And so that's where this whole concept of non-self comes from. And then where these three interpretations that Thompson explains become important is in understanding, okay, well, how does this make sense? We have this Brahmanical view of what a person is, of what samsara, the world we live in, is. How does non-self fit into that context? And so there's questions of different sutras where the monks, the disciples, are asking, is this self? Could this be self? Is
Mhm.
this where the self could reside if there was one? And the Buddha has to go through each of those things and say, no, it couldn't be there. It's not there and it could not be there.
Gotcha. Great, thank you for that. That was a good summary. I think it would be helpful as well. You had mentioned the Buddhist notions of anatman and anicca. I think that's the Sanskrit. Could you give a brief overview of the three marks of reality in Buddhist philosophy? Just because maybe that might be helpful in kind of, you know, um, laying the groundwork for, whatever we'll get into with non-self.
Absolutely, yeah. So the three
Great.
marks of reality are also known as the three Dharma seals. Dharma being, the teaching of the Buddha, and those three are emptiness or non-self. Those are synonymous, really, on
Mhm.
Atman. Um, then there's impermanence, which is anicca, as you say. And then there is dukkha, which is what we commonly translate as suffering. I think that suffering is a catastrophizing translation, and it it's an inaccurate translation. Sorry,
Mhm.
it's an inaccurate translation that goes all the way back to whenever Buddhism was first traveling to China. It speaks to the dissatisfactoriness of the world. It doesn't
Mhm.
speak to agony, pain, and suffering and fire and brimstone, right?
Right.
Suffering, as we call it, dukkha, it could include even moments of euphoria and joy. The world is dissatisfactory because moments of euphoria and joy are fleeting, and
Mhm.
they will always return back to a state of neutrality, which is neutral, or true suffering, agony, emotional pain, sadness, depression, anger, rage, any of these things.
I see.
So
Hmm.
we desire for this permanent euphoria and joy, and we don't get it, and that gap is called dukkha. So dukkha doesn't necessarily mean just the bad parts. It also can refer to how the good parts are fleeting. They're not going to be there forever. So those are the three marks, and those are sort of the foundation in which this non-self discussion sits.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Thank you for outlining that. Sorry, I probably should have led with that.
No,
Just to
it's okay. No problem.
guide the, lay the foundation. But you did a great job of outlining that for everyone. I think so. Thank you. Um, okay. So we have kind of the conceptual framework that Buddhism is kind of evolving in response to. Um, what are your ideas for this chapter in particular? Where would you like to start? You're the expert here. I'd like to give you, um, kind of let you take the reins for this one.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'm glad to speak to some of my responses to what Thompson is up to here.
Great.
So this was the chapter, and I told Christian this whenever we were talking about recording this. episode and getting ready for it, I have the most issues with this part out of any part of the book that I've read, and I've read the whole thing. This is a very central chapter to his argument and to what he's up to and to why this book exists, right? This is very core and key. And there are lots of mistakes and lots of omissions and lots of false equivalencies and lots of dubious interpretations of things that I think are at best unfair and at worst negligent and even sort of, I don't know, critical and even a little bit mean spirited. And so um,
Gotcha.
we will get into those. So to preface my response to this chapter, I want to say that I fully believe personally the doctrine of non-self. I'm convinced by it textually. So you should know that I have that bias. I think that it's strongly supported by the texts themselves, and I think it's strongly supported by the life that I live and the world that I see around me. And so take that as you will. I'm fully convinced, but I want to make it clear that he had the chance to convince me otherwise here, and he didn't. He failed. So let's talk about how and why he failed.
Sure.
So the first point that he jumps into in this issue of non-self is an analysis of the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, or as it's called in that's the Pali name. It's called in Sanskrit the Anatma Lakshana Sutra. And this is the discourse on the characteristic of non-self. And his analysis of it is fine. I don't have any issue with that part of it. I think that he describes it accurately, and I think that he has read it and understood it. But what he
Mm,
goes on to do after he's read it is he starts to tug on that analysis and he starts to push into it and criticize it a little bit and start to pull it apart. And I don't think that the sutra he chose is enough to challenge and pull apart one of these three marks of existence, one of the foundations of Buddhist doctrine.
mm.
The Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, which interestingly, I just read and discussed on Bright on Buddhism not too long ago. It'll be on all the platforms in a couple of weeks.
Awesome.
It's 1 page long, and it doesn't address anything else other than what it says it addresses. It addresses the characteristic of non-self as it relates to the five aggregates.
Mm,
I'll describe what those mean in a moment. But I want to mention that the Buddha does not quit preaching after he preaches this. He gives this sermon as his second teaching ever, traditionally by legend. We don't know if that's historically true, but that's what everybody says, is that this was his second teaching after the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So
mm.
there are tons of other sutras where the Buddha explains all of the other things that don't constitute a self or Atman, and where he makes the case for non-self in a better way that would make Evan Thompson's argument weaker. So I think that there's a bit of a straw man issue going on here.
I
So
see.
to this issue of the five aggregates, in this Hindu cosmology, the self, the person, whatever you like to call it, the small s self, not the capital S self, right, as is referred to by Atman, but like the small s self, you and me and the world around us. We are constituted of five aggregations of forces or of things that group together and become us. There's physical form, so we're aggregations of physical matter. There is sensation, so the fact that we can see, smell, taste, touch, hear, and think is an aggregation of senses and sensory objects. There's an aggregation of perceptions. These are judgments of, or these are cognitions of our senses. So I know that I'm seeing something. I know that I'm hearing something.
Right.
And then there's mental formations. So we all have within us these aggregations of memory and judgments of what we've sensed. This sensation was good or bad. And we have consciousness, which governs the entire process. That's the fifth aggregate, is consciousness. And we'll talk more about how to understand consciousness in the Buddhist sense in a moment. But
Sure.
the question that the Buddha has posed essentially at the beginning of this sutta is, are the five aggregates where this capital S self is or could be? And the Buddha says no. and he goes through each of the five and he says, these are non-self. And Evan Thompson acts like this is the only time that the Buddha ever speaks about non-self. And he's like, the Buddha says the five aggregates are not self. And then he never, and you know, maybe they could be self. And then he moves on. And he doesn't say like anything about any of the other texts, any of the other foundational texts, which I would even argue are even more important than this sutta to Buddhism, where non-self is described and explained. And I don't think that that's very fair. Um, how
Mhm.
did you respond to his discussion of the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta?
Yeah, thanks for um thanks for turning that question back to me. I think I'd like to highlight that I appreciate you being forthcoming with your biases because we all have them and we're all, you know, you can't escape them.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it highlights kind of the differences between how you and I approach the book. Like am uh I like that you said that you were, if I understood correctly, it's like you're um evaluating the notion of self versus non-self purely on Buddhist terms, purely
Mhm.
on um like the textual terms. And I think that's really cool. Um I'm more concerned with the, you know, kind of his primary focus of the book, which is Buddhist modernism. So
Mhm.
um forget where I was going with that. I think I would say I can't really speak too much to like that sutra in particular or how he picks it apart. Though I do kind of um I do appreciate that like perspective of like, well, why did he only focus on this particular um sutra? And it might have been because of Robert Wright, but if that was the case, then maybe he could have given a stronger sutra to support his own view. Um, but I think that overall it hasn't necessarily convinced me of a belief in self in the Brahminical sense. But it has certainly opened me up to the perspective that um at least in terms of, you know, what it is in reality, let's say, it's more complicated than that. It's a very rich historical um debate that evolves over time, and that's kind of how I'm reading this book. But I again, it is interesting because you're saying it's like, no, I'm reading it based on the text and how well that applies to my own experience. Um, so I'm sorry, I forget what the question is, but
No, that's okay. I was asking mainly
yeah.
about his analysis of the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, and it sounds like it didn't fully convince you of the existence of a self, but it did open up the possibility. I think
Mhm.
that it's tough because I'm also very much like he is, like Evan Thompson is, against this concept, this idea of Buddhist modernism and all of the interpretive jumps and mistakes and purposeful and non-purposeful misunderstandings they make along the way. But
Yeah.
if he's going to tear it down, he's got to do better. I mean, this
Mhm.
I think this choice of sutra of text was very poor, and I think that if he, you know, the Heart Sutra, for example, or the Lankavatara Sutra, these are sutras that basically destroy his argument. And you could argue, you know, okay, well, you could say, oh, well, this sutra is not given by the Buddha. The Heart Sutra is given by Avalokiteshvara. Or you could say, like, oh, the Lankavatara Sutra is a Mahayana Sutra. It comes much later, blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah. But it doesn't matter because Buddhists still read those things. And certainly Buddhist modernists still read those things. And that's factoring in. I mean, whenever Buddhism gets to America, it's coming as a complete singular total product in the
Mhm.
form of course, like the practices that East Asian migrants to the United States are doing, but also in terms of the texts that get translated, there's no understanding of the difference between Mahayana and Theravada or between early and late because we didn't know that stuff yet. We had to learn that stuff after we got the package, after we, you know, after we opened everything up and started unpacking it. So I think that I think that it's not really, I don't want to say, I don't think it's rigorous in his analysis. His
Mm,
choice and his analysis itself both are just not, they're not there for that sutta for me.
okay, gotcha. Yeah, I can see that. Again, I like as I'm thinking about it, I think that one in particular, probably he did choose because that's the one that Robert Wright
Yeah.
um focuses on in his book, which this book is a response to. Um, but yeah, what am I trying to say? I sense a bit of radicalism in Thompson, and I know that because I'm that way. Um,
Yeah.
but I do agree with you that I think sometimes he kind of oversteps the bounds of what's reasonably interpretable based on the textual evidence. Um, kind of in maybe this like overzealous pursuit of like, well, we have to like, really crack down on this Buddhist modernist thing. And sometimes misses nuance perhaps in that. Um, I guess just since we're talking about it, and maybe this would be kind of a good place to lay the foundation for, you know, getting into some more of his arguments. What do you see as some common ground between you and Thompson on this chapter? Because for me at least, I think that I see his primary goal as kind of uh like a counter to the Buddhist modernist notion of non-self as being validated by science. And if I had to articulate that, like the position that he's probably speaking against, it would probably be something like, well, because of neuroscience, like we see in the brain that there is um no self, basically. You can't see a self in there. And honestly, I think it's kind of akin to like a militant atheist perspective of like, oh, dude, see, Buddhism says like there's no self, man, so there's no self here. But I think that his like critique of that position is pretty solid. Now, again, in terms of the textual, um if he is well, I guess let's start there. What do you think of his like critique against that very neurocentric, perhaps, view of non-self that we see in Buddhist modernism?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like I am entirely against Evan Thompson in general or in this chapter. I definitely share his same distaste for this this movement or this idea or this desire to justify religious claims with scientific means and vice versa.
Hmm.
And I think that this is a particularly fraught discussion in the context of Buddhism because Western science and Buddhism have a colonial history that the people who are doing all of this are not aware of, and they're not, they're not being careful with. And this is also sort of violating a tenet of science, which is that science does not make or attempt to make religious claims in the sense of like claims that are not verifiable or falsifiable, claims that are not observable or experimentable. And
Right.
it also violates sort of the religious aspect in the sense of revising religious texts so that it fits a particular narrative. I'm not one to say that science and religion should be fully, totally always separate in every case all the time, but I don't think that the attempt to try and prove non-self or disprove non-self with science, with neuroscience, with psychology, with biology, I don't think that that is a worthwhile pursuit because
Hmm.
I think that this idea of a self or a non-self is primarily a linguistic discussion. It's a matter of how we are talking about stuff. It's not a
Right.
matter of what is or is not. It's a matter of how we know what there is in front of us or what there is not in front of us, and a matter of how we talk about it and how we talk to ourselves about it. So
Yeah.
much of what Buddhism is about is really, in a lot of ways, changing how you mentally label stuff to yourself. And I think that that's kind of the important upshot. So the conclusion of my feeling that way, the conclusion to your point of common ground between me and Evan Thompson, I'm all there with him on his goals. And that's one of the reasons why I think that some of this analysis should have been better and more fair. Um,
Mhm.
is because I want to see him do this very well and do it right. But another reason is that um, because I think that this is a linguistic issue and because I think that it's anachronistic to put Buddhism and neuroscience together in this way in an attempt to prove one or the other, um, is because I think that the neuroscience idea of self as a construction, as he puts it, a construction in the sense of it being sort of like a symphony of different lobes of the brain and different parts of the body all coming together into this sort of self-awareness we have, this awareness of the boundaries between our body and the rest of the world, and
Yeah.
everything that goes on in this body being internal and everything goes on out there being external. Um, I don't think that any of that is incompatible with non-self at all. I think that something being a construction does not mean that it cannot be an illusion. Buddhism
Mhm.
claims that Atman is an illusion. Thinking that it is there is an illusion. It's not there.
Right.
And that's why I think it's a linguistic issue, is because like part of his argument is hinging on this idea of construction being a more, I don't know, fastidious term than illusion, but they're not, it's not like that at all. A
Okay.
construction is absolutely it's absolutely able to be illusory. We're
Yeah.
constructing in response to this desire we have, right? And so it's like, I don't
So
know. I think that his goals are rightly oriented, but his method of making his arguments and taking his stance could be better.
gotcha. Yeah, no, that is super interesting. This idea of like illusion and construction. And I'll say this much. I do think that he can be a little like pedantic at times of
Mhm.
like, oh, like uh construction versus like whatever. And um I I I I I see where you're coming from with that. Um and I even wrote in my book like, okay, there's a lot of I forget. I have a lot of like mean like angry question marks by a lot of stuff because I just didn't understand like why he um seemed so like set on the exact particular language in in a certain spot. Um but okay, no, thank you for that. I appreciate and I'm not just looking for common ground for I mean,
Oh, of
we
course. Yeah,
all
yeah.
disagree and whatever, but it helps to, I think, like clarify um kind of the ideas that we have. So to me it sounds like you like very much agree with this like critique of Buddhist modernism, and specifically kind of like a neurocentric um view of Buddhist non-self. Um, I would like to ask the question that I had posed to you in the notes that I sent at this point, because I think that is probably more of what you are interested in with all this stuff, which is, you know, self versus non-self. We've covered that the Buddhist modernist conception is insufficient, and it's not really all that great for all the reasons that Thompson outlines. So that's cool. Now we can move into your own thoughts again based on like the textual evidence. So I'll just read what I sent you. So I'll speak to my own thoughts here. I've had this thought for a while. The notion of non-self seems to be intrinsically wrapped up in the notion of impermanence. In other words, there can be no unchanging eternal something because everything is necessarily changing. Um, Via impermanence, as one of the three marks of reality. Um, and yet, doesn't the principle of impermanence itself constitute some sort of eternal, unchanging ontological essence of reality? Um, Namely, that change is the only constant, according to at least according to Buddhism. And then I said, in my own view, this points to a certain non-dual quality of the notion of self. Um, and just kind of like, yeah, like I have absolutely no idea to think about it beyond that. So I'm really curious what you have to say here, just because I've had that thought like so many times, and it's just seems like a huge mystery to me.
Absolutely, yeah. No, this is a great question, and I'm glad that you put it forward. I think that this is a question that comes up quite a lot in people who are seriously thinking about Buddhism. I get this question for one. I also have gotten the question of, you know, if non-self, then what reincarnates, right? And so I think that my answer will speak to questions like that, questions of um, the limits, you might say, or the nature of impermanence and non-self in the Buddhist
Awesome.
textual sense. So
Sure.
the the deal about impermanence being the only constant is interesting. So this is something that actually does come up in the canon sometimes, the Pali Canon.
Hmm.
A question is posed. You're saying all these things, oh great Lord Shakyamuni Buddha. Impermanence, emptiness, dukkha. Are these things themselves subject to impermanence, emptiness, dukkha? And the Buddha says in response, no, they're not. These are impermanence is not impermanent. Emptiness is not empty. Dukkha is not suffering right now. You know what I mean? Dukkha is, suffering is not actually undergoing the feeling, the sensation of suffering.
Mm.
And the way that he makes this argument, the way that he sort of puts this forward is that impermanence is not a thing in reality. You can't touch it, you can't see it, smell it, taste it, hear it. You can think about it, but you're thinking about a principle. You're not thinking about a thing. You're not thinking about a situation. So there's a distinction made in Buddhism. The vocabulary we use to call things in reality, be they objects, thoughts, feelings, sensations, experiences, cognitions, whatever.
Mm.
This is actually the word dharma. It's just used with a small d. So there's a list out there of dharmas, the dharmas, right? And it's not talking about different teachings as of the Buddha. It's talking about different things in reality. So
So like different phenomena, if I
yes,
maybe put
exactly.
it that way. Okay.
Yeah. So phenomena are subject to impermanence, emptiness, dukkha, but impermanence, emptiness, dukkha are not phenomena themselves. The Dharma, the big D Dharma, the Buddhist teaching, it is not a situation. It's not a phenomenon. It's not something that goes on for a while and then stops. The Dharma is sort of the foundation, it's the source code of all reality and is not subject to itself. So
Mm.
impermanence is permanent, impermanence is eternal, impermanence is constant. And so too is dukkha and anatman. So it's kind of people really like to take impermanence to the extreme. Um, they really like to think of it as being so universal that even it will get to itself. And that's not actually the case in Buddhism. So
Mm.
yeah, there is no sense of self in that sense because impermanence is too universal. It's too um, comprehensive, you might say. Let,
Gotcha.
let me pull up some of my notes about this just to make sure that I got everything
Sure, yeah.
here.
I will say I do feel a little bit of my Ichantika self coming out here, just in the sense that like um I don't know. It seems like um and I'll step outside of Buddhism here to give give credit to that. But yeah, it's like I feel like reality is just so whatever it is, it's just so like complex and mysterious. And I know that's not really saying anything, but like I don't know.
No,
I
it's
don't know.
fascinating. I think that
Super fascinating. Yeah.
I think that being a good Achantika is a lot of fun. Yeah, so I've basically spoken to the issue of impermanence as you posed it into the question, I think. Um, Whenever you point to a certain non-dual quality of the notion of self, I think that's fascinating. So
Mhm,
this is where emptiness comes in. When you speak to a non-dual quality of self, what I'm interpreting is that you're saying that it points to the sort of provisional existence of a self.
mhm,
And impermanence is that's actually a very important characteristic of impermanence. Impermanence doesn't mean on the one extreme that there's random chaos all the time.
mhm.
And on the other extreme, there's no such thing as permanence. So the reality is in the middle. There is actually relative continuity that we can observe. And one of the ways that we can observe this is in our lives. There is an incredibly small chance that I'm going to stop being me in the next instant and in the instant after that and the instant after that and turn into a potato or something. That's just not going to happen. But that being the case does not preclude that impermanence exists. I may be myself in the next instant or the instant after that, but will I be in 7 years after all my cells have replaced themselves? You could argue no. Will I be in however many years before I die? When I have died, will I still be myself? No, I'll be a corpse. And whenever my corpse dissolves into the ground and turns into dirt, will I still be myself? No, I'll be dirt. So, what's
Yeah.
important about impermanence to observe is that it's operating on macrocosmic and microcosmic scales. And of course, it's operating on like observable scales. If you leave lunch meat on the counter for 4 hours, it will no longer be food, right? That's impermanence. But it's also operating on the scale of galaxies and the universe. The universe, in however many hundreds of trillions of years, will not look the same as it does now. And
Mhm.
it's operating on microscopic scales in the sense that we are all sort of vibrating, right? That's sort of I think that's the scientific consensus now, as I understand it, is that according to string theory, the physicality of matter is a result of vibration. And because of that vibration, it's impossible to sort of pin down where a specific particle is at any one point in time, because those particles are also waves. So, in that sense, impermanence is also operating at the microscopic scale because it's it's impossible to actually pin anything down as being in one place for any amount of time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how impermanence is presented to operate in Buddhism.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. I had a thought as you were I forget exactly what you said, but it seemed like you were pointing to a certain coherence and orderliness of reality, you know, um, not even in spite of impermanence, but kind of like as along with impermanence.
Yes.
Um, what accounts for that orderliness and coherence within Buddhism with respect to impermanence?
I'm so glad you asked because this is an important critique, a very important critique of chapter 3 of Evan Thompson's book.
Awesome.
The answer to relative continuity and that which both misguided neuroscientists and misguided Evan Thompson refer to as a self, the reason for that is karma, is morality in the Buddhist sense. Okay, now I'm not espousing my own views here. I'm speaking to how Buddhism explains the world around us. So don't think that I'm like on a soapbox preaching to you, but I
Mhm,
am speaking to one of the most important things in Buddhism, and
mhm,
that's karma. So we commonly have this interpretation that karma is what goes around comes around. If I am mean to a guy this morning, I will probably have a fender bender this afternoon. Right? That's kind of the modern colloquial notion of what karma is. If somebody does
mhm.
something bad and then something bad happens to them, we say that's karma, right?
You're gonna get yours. Yeah.
Exactly. This is a misunderstanding or an oversimplification of how karma actually works.
Mm,
So, because of our actions, all of our actions have foreseen and unforeseen consequences. And those consequences, if they were to be enumerated and held up to the moral system in Buddhism, could be categorized as good, neutral, bad.
Mhm.
And from that, based on, the majority of the outcomes, you might say, um, if the majority of the outcomes are good, you could say, make a strong argument that the action was good, and vice
Mhm.
versa. If it was bad, you could say the action was bad.
Mhm.
And those consequences create momentum in the universe. They create momentum. And so the consequences of actions then become the causes and conditions for other actions. So this is where causality sort of comes in. If something good happens right now, it will have good consequences, and those good consequences will cause further good to happen. And this is why, specifically why, we should act good in the world, so that we are causing more good in the future. That's sort of how we are being compassionate individuals. Compassion and morality are one and the same in Buddhism. So, in that
Mhm.
sense, um, karma is sort of the ever rumbling engine of reality as it presents itself to us. It's
Mhm.
painting everything as we see it. That momentum comes back around to the world that we see, the world that we experience. Because whenever these actions have consequences, those are sort of the they're sort of the fruits of seeds that are planted in us, and they plant seeds in us and become fruits later. So the reason why we experience the world as we do is a direct result of karma
Mhm.
in Buddhism. And so our experiencing the world as we do as human beings or as ants or as, demons or as devas or gods, that is a result of all of our karma. So that karma is sort of like momentum, but it's also sort of magnetism, right? Because let's say that I was born infirm. This is something that Buddhism, I think, is a little weak on. If I was born infirm, according to Buddhist doctrine, that's because I did so many bad actions in the past that I've been born and I'm sort of having this bad experience being infirm because of something I did past lives ago. I don't think that's very nice. I think that's kind of victim blaming. But
Mhm.
either way, that's sort of how they present it. So
Yeah.
these aggregates I talked about take shape according to karma. Karma modulates and modifies and sort of controls, you could say, these aggregates. But because it controls or modulates these things, we can't say that karma itself is sentient or that it is a sort of force of physics or of nature. It doesn't sort of decide things. It's not an arbiter. It's just the reflexive property of the universe. Whenever you put something into it, it will sort of amplify and take that thing and make it go further, if that makes sense. There can be no cause without an effect, and there can be no effect without a cause. And because of that cause and effect, that's how we end up where we are now. And becoming enlightened is understanding that series, that cause and effect series that goes all the way back to beginningless time. So you come to know exactly what will cause what to happen at all times. The reason why this is a critique of Evan Thompson is because a discussion of karma, a discussion of the moral context of Buddhism, would make all of this non-self stuff, all of the analysis he presents, just go right down the toilet. He has
Got
picked out this non-self doctrine. He's picked out this foundational concept in Buddhism, and he said why he thinks this isn't true, but he has ignored the moral context in which it exists. He's ignored the moral situation and the causal situation and the cosmological situation in which it exists to try and say that it's not true. I personally don't have these huge disagreements with the Buddhist modernist view of non-self because
Mhm.
there isn't really one. I haven't actually seen a lot of Buddhist modernists talking that much about non-self because frankly, they don't understand it. It's kind of a difficult concept. What I see them talking about is karma. What I see them talking about is compassion and suffering. And so I don't think that it was fair to take out non-self and not talk about how non-self is situated in a moral framework.
Yeah. Um, yeah, thank you for that. That helped clarify things. Okay, I'm gonna pause really quickly.
Sure.
Uh, okay, cool, we're back. So I was just asking Nick, it seems like to me, um, and I think I agree. I think with respect to karma, I think that like a lot of this discussion could have been circumvented by relying not rely like by emphasizing more like the role of karma. And he does do that, like to his credit. He does, bring that up, but it's kind of only like a single line. He doesn't talk about it all that much. Um what I was interested in is the notion of karma itself, and then I guess as it pertains to consciousness. So to me, um, and I'm kind of asking what Buddhism says here, but then also I guess kind of like your own interpretation of it. To me, this notion that the universe like has this order where actions produce certain outcomes, and like this momentum is kind of built, but also it's impartial in the sense that it doesn't really like the outcomes that it produces aren't like, again, like you're saying, like they're not intended to punish people, and maybe that's the colloquial um you know kind of view of karma, but to me it almost does seem like there is some sort of consciousness to it, some sort of like uh yeah, I don't know, some sort of like conscious intention. And I don't want to overstep what Buddhism would have to say about it, so I will ask what, kind of the Buddhist assessment is. Um, and then I'll kind of ask for your own interpretation there.
Yeah, of course. Sure. So karma, like impermanence and emptiness and dukkha, are characteristics of the world. They are not themselves phenomena in the world. Saying that karma is a phenomenon in the world would kind of be like saying that a phenomenon is a phenomenon in the world, because another way that I've often seen karma rendered in English is not just causality or causation, but as action, right? And this action is speaking to the movement in between cause and effect. That's not something that anybody has to do. Nobody has to like touch it or push it. If you do a thing, there will if there is an action, there will be an equal and opposite reaction. That's kind of a thing that applies not just to physics, not just to matter, but to anything and everything in the world. If I say the word elephant, you will think about the word elephant.
Hmm.
And that's the relationship between cause and effect. So the way that consciousness plays into this comes about in mind only doctrine, which is very central to Chan, Zen, Yogacara, Pure Land Buddhism, as we have discussed lots before. And
Hmm.
this is where we get back into that discussion of the consciousness aggregate, the Vijnana that I talked about.
I see.
So Evan Thompson brings up this ongoing neuroscience issue, the binding problem and the unity of consciousness problem.
Hmm.
And the binding problem speaks to the problem of how whenever we are cognizing a thing like a cup or our phone or something, we have visual, we have sense like touch sensory, and we have auditory, and we have olfactory smell, and we have all these different sensory lanes, so to speak, which are, you know, which are receiving information. And somehow, even though this lights up different parts of the brain, it gets sort of fused together for our experience, where we experience a singular thing. We don't experience five or six different pieces of information kind of separate from each other. They get bound into a single thing. And the unity of consciousness is similar. Our brains light up in response to different experiences, and our internal experiences light up different parts of our brains. So, how is it that we have this singular unitary awareness of self? How is it that it's not sort of like a ghost in a shell that goes from one lobe to the next lobe to the other lobe to the other lobe. The way that Buddhism solves this problem, not that it ever was a problem for Buddhism, but it is for Thompson, so we should solve it. He's clearly bothered by it, so I'm happy to fix that for him.
Are we getting into the discussion of the Aliyah
Yes.
video here?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I was looking forward to this, so let's go.
Yeah. So
What do you
the
got?
Vijnana consciousness aggregate is broken up into 8 different consciousnesses. The 8 Vijnanas.
I'm sorry, Nick. I could you break down or translate, I guess, what the Aliyah Vijñana is, and then kind of um like go from there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So one of these 8 consciousnesses, or this one of these 8 Vijnanas, is the storehouse consciousness.
Mm,
Um, these Vijnanas are the 6 sense Vijnanas. So cognition of seeing, cognition of touching, cognition of hearing, cognition of thinking, right? And then the the seventh one is going to be manas, which is our diluted self-awareness or our diluted metacognition. This is our awareness of our sensory perceptions. And this is the thing that Buddhism argues we often mistake for being a self.
hmm
It's not one. And then there's the Alaya Vijnana, the storehouse consciousness. This is the aggregate that serves as the foundation for all of the rest of our lives over the course of our rebirths. It's the foundation for all the rest of the Vijnanas. It's the foundation for it's the foundation for how we experience the world as mediated through karma. And it's called the storehouse because it is the storage place of karmic seeds that turn into karmic fruits. So when karma is introduced into the lexicon in a Buddhist context, there's an open question. Who's keeping score? Who is looking at everybody's actions and saying, okay, this person gets +1 for this, but -2 for that, but +6 for this? Who's calculating, right? Who's tabulating? And
Okay.
if no one is tabulating, then where is this property being reflected? Where is this action upon the world being, you know, being manifested in an observable way? The Jains, the Jain for Jainism in India, they actually think that karma is a black matter that hangs on the soul. It's like lead on the actual soul, and it like weighs you down. It's like a very physical thing. Um, that's one answer to the question. But the Buddhist answer to the question, of course, is that karma is not acting upon the world in the sense that a conscious or sentient actor acts upon the world. And so, therefore, there can be no effect if karma is a cause because it's linguistically, semantically incorrect to think of karma as a cause. It doesn't function as a cause. It's the name, the linguistic word we use to speak to the relationship between cause and effect in the Buddhist context. So, anyways, back to this storehouse consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana. This foundation itself is not morally or religiously pure, nor is it morally or religiously neutral, nor is it morally or religiously bad. It's none of those. It's not a moral thing, so to speak. It's a property of the consciousness aggregate that it stores these things, that that it acts in the way that it does. So I've solved this binding problem because we have the 6 senses and the 6 cognitions of our senses. I know that I'm seeing, I know I'm hearing, I know I'm smelling, I know I'm touching. And we have the metacognition, the manas, which synthesizes all these things. So that solves the binding and the unity of consciousness problem. The aggregate of consciousness fixes that.
Yeah. So I'll say before I forget. What was I gonna say? So if then what accounts for who is keeping the score, so to speak, in karma, seems to be constituted in the Abhidharma, or in this case specifically in Yogacara doctrine. Um, it is the Alaya Vijnana, storehouse consciousness, which is in Yogacara doctrine, uh, a core. ontological status, not even status, but like element of the mind. So if that's the case, and if that, we're extrapolating that to make an ontological claim about reality by way of karma and how karma affects all of reality, is that where we get this idea of consciousness only that we see in Yogacara doctrine?
Yes, that's exactly where it comes from.
Dude, we did it, Reddit.
Yeah, yeah. And this is so we're celebrating because this was some of the really hard material that we learned together in class many, many, many years ago, many rebirths, many past lives ago. Um,
Yes, yes.
so this Alaya Vijnana factors into this mind-only doctrine that we see in Yogacara Buddhism.
Mhm.
Our day-to-day experiences, we've already spoken them as both causes and effects. There's a causal element to it and an effect element. It's pick an experience, a phenomenon in our day-to-day life, and you can say of it that it was caused by something and it will cause something else.
Mhm.
So in that sense, let's think of it just for now as a cause of something. One of the causes it will be a it'll be a cause for the planting of a karmic seed in your alaya vijnana.
Mhm.
This karmic seed is called a bija. Now it's up for debate if this is like a seed
Wait,
or
sorry,
like
what will plant the seed?
the experience, the thing that happens, the phenomenon, the small d dharma.
Okay.
It's a bija, and it's up for debate if this is a metaphorical way of referring to the thing or if it's like actually going to function like plants and seeds, like something grows, something is planted, etc. Um, that's a debate we don't need to get into, but the bija plants into our alaya vijnana, and these seeds, while the vijnana is not, these seeds are karmic. They're good, bad, neutral, and they grow into fruits. And this is the effect nature of an experience, of a phenomenon. So whenever a seed fruits, that is an experience we have. And that answers the question of like who's keeping the score and how does karma function? Well, it functions because phenomenon A plants a seed in our consciousness, and phenomenon B is the fruit of that seed in our day-to-day experience. And there's just this back and forth going on between our alaya vijnana and our day-to-day lives.
Mm.
Per that interpretation, bad karmic seeds always lead to bad experiences, which makes sense. Bad begets bad, good begets good, neutral begets neutral.
Mhm.
So the process by which phenomenon turns into seed is through our cognition. I see phenomenon A and I cognize that I'm seeing phenomenon A, and I make a judgment about if that cognization of phenomenon A was good or bad, and that plants a seed, and that seed determines my future behaviors and it determines my future experience. So cognition goes that way. And this weird, very interesting process brings seeds to fruit the other way. It's translated as perfumation or projection.
Mhm.
So a seed in the Alaya Vijnana will go in reverse order through our five aggregates, and it will um, color or perfume or project our experiences. So, like I said, karmic seed will change how I behave, how I think, how I act in the world around me. And so it is a cause for my day-to-day life experience being good, bad, or neutral, according to what that seed was. This is most perfectly captured with an analogy to mental illness psychology disciplines way of looking at trauma. Something happens in your life that fundamentally changes how you view the world and yourself, and you act differently in the world and you think of yourself differently because of this thing that's happened, right? That's kind of an extreme negative example, but it demonstrates the principle that's going on here.
Yeah.
So this
Kind of.
perfumation or this projection goes the other way, and your alaya vijnana is sort of modulating what your five, or in Buddhism's case, six senses are experiencing. This is why they call it mind only doctrine, because all of our day to day experience, not one thing in it is anything other than a perfumation or a projection of our minds, of our Alaya Vijnana. Now, again, it's up for debate if this is solipsism, the view that
Yeah.
only I exist and nothing else exists. It's up for debate if this is idealism, not the idealism of like, oh, yeah, I want what's best for the world. Idealism in the sense of believing Descartes when he says, I think, therefore I am. Idealism in the
Mhm.
sense that consciousness constitutes existence. Um, that's philosophical idealism, you might say, instead of like day to day colloquial idealism.
Yeah.
It's up for debate if it's either of those things. I believe that it is neither. I'm convinced that it's neither of those things, but that's a discussion for another time, I think. But
Yeah.
that's sort of the
Well,
Alaya system.
yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for this is what I came here for. This is exactly what I came here for. Yeah, I if I had to give a and I here's where the angry, annotations came in. I'm like, expand on this more, because he writes about the Alayavichnana, but he talks about it for like half a paragraph. Like
Yeah, and
this
that's it.
would have been where to invest like all of his energy, I feel like. This would have been a great place, but I don't know. I see what you mean. I think he could have done focused a little better. And I would argue, if we're getting into this discussion of non-self, then how could he not elaborate on Yogacara doctrine at all? Not to say that Yogacara doctrine speaks for all of Buddhism, obviously, but um, yeah, that I think the discussion that we're having now is filling in much of the gaps that he could have here. Um,
Well, I think the reason he didn't pull out Yogacara, didn't pull out mind only doctrine is because it makes his conclusions wrong. There is no, um, whenever you discuss this Alaya Vijnana system, the Vijnana system, the Yogacara system of
mm,
consciousness and mind and experience, then I think that it thoroughly does away with the binding problem, the unity of consciousness problem, and it also speaks directly to the fact that what does the binding can be mistaken for self, but is indeed not self, and also that the Alaya Vijnana is not self either. Because in order to reach enlightenment, of course, you want to put only good in the Alaya Vijnana so that it perfumes and projects only good on the world around you. But also, eventually, you want to do away with this process of cognition and perfumation entirely so that there is no Alaya Vijnana. Once you have no Alaya Vijnana, then you have left the world. You have nirvana, you have enlightenment. So I think that it's not something that he could have actually torn down as easy as the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta.
okay, that makes sense. I totally get what you're saying now. Like this would have been the, I guess like this would have been a lot more difficult. And I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not saying Buddhism is right. It could be wrong. And I want to get to that right now actually, but I do think that yeah, like this would have been the more challenging thing to argue. And maybe he could have done it, but he didn't. He didn't talk about it that much. He only mentioned it for like a few lines. Um, I will say this because I have a feeling that you would like to respond here. So after he mentions the Alayavijnana very briefly, um, he says the Brahminical philosophers argue that Buddhists are smuggling in a self through the back door here with the concept of the Alayavijnana. So yeah, what would your response to that be? And speaking in Buddhist terms.
Well, I am of the opinion that it does not constitute anything like a self for a few reasons. One
Mm,
reason is that when Brahminical people say that, they are coming from a context of Brahman and of pure consciousness. So we talked about one of the interpretations of non-self that pervaded during and after the Buddha's life of a pure consciousness. So some people have thought that this Alaya Vijnana is a pure singular consciousness. Whenever people say mind only in the distant past, they don't think of solipsism or idealism like we do. They think of more like all of reality is but one singular large consciousness that through delusion and illusion thinks that it is separate consciousnesses occupying all these different organisms, all these different sentient beings. And that true awakening, true enlightenment is to disabuse yourself of that notion and return to being part of the singular universal consciousness. Not only, of course, does the Buddha and Evan Thompson rightly say that that's not correct, but also the Alaya Vijnana has it's a phenomenon, just like any other phenomenon. It's a small d dharma. It's a small d dharma in the sense that my life,
Just like impermanence is not impermanent and emptiness
yes,
is empty of itself. Okay.
the Alaya Vijnana is impermanent. It is empty. It is subject to dukkha. So in that sense, there's no way that it could be a self because it too goes away, right? It doesn't constitute our souls. It doesn't constitute it doesn't it's not unchanged. It's changed every
Yeah,
moment that we are cognizing and experiencing. And so
right.
it can't be a piece of
Yeah.
Brahman, nor can it be a piece of pure consciousness, nor can it be a soul in the Christian Western way of thinking of a soul. It can't be either of those things, any of those things. It's changing over the course of many lifetimes. And so its existence is due solely to the momentum that we have in our lives of undertaking karmic action. It's kind of
Gotcha.
an esoteric, hard to understand presentation of things, but the goal of Buddhism is eventually to no longer act karmically. So the Alaya Vijnana goes away whenever you stop acting karmically.
So then you kind of just disappear almost.
That's why nirvana translates to like blowing out or being extinguished.
That is so like like as you're talking about all this, I just have this idea of like a stream, like a cosmic stream. I don't know of what, like of energy or something. It just like, but
And
it's
then Nick said this, and his disciple Christian was enlightened and earned his own Pure Land for 4 Mahakalpas.
we did it.
No, I'm
We did.
joking. There's no way.
No, that's no, this has been a very thoroughly enlightening discussion, honestly. And you know, I know that you have a lot of disagreements with Thompson, and now I know why, and they're good disagreements. Um, but if there is one thing that I do appreciate about him, it is kind of opening up this discussion like that we're having now, although he doesn't talk about it specifically, of like no, it's not just like um fMRI scans don't identify like a particular like stable like network over time. It's like that's not what we're referring to. And if you want to get into that argument, like you'll probably do a bad job at it and it's not even that interesting. Like this to me is like profoundly interesting. Um so yeah, that's really cool. All right, we did it. Episode over. No, I where would you like to go from here? Because I do, yeah, I do think that that does answer some. It covers. I'm remiss that he didn't speak about this himself. Uh,
I feel the same way.
yeah, that I wrote in there like, how could you not, mention Yogacara doctrine if we're talking about um this concept? It um would have been great, but you did a really good job of outlining that and articulating that. And
Thanks.
yeah, that was just such an awesome discussion. um I had another question, but I forget it. Would you like to follow up on any of the other anything else that he mentioned in this chapter?
Yeah, so I had one final question for you about this.
Mm,
So I have been speaking primarily, of course, to the Buddhist textual and doctrinal dimensions of why I think Evan Thompson is right or wrong on this episode. And one reason for that is that I cannot speak to the neuroscience or the psychology or the brain matter, so to speak, the science of it all at nearly the level of depth that, you know, would be useful for this conversation for understanding if he is right about it. So, um, of course, my reasoning is that it's anachronistic, but all of that aside, I'm curious if you think that his discussions of the neuroscientific and the psychological are actually worth anything, if they're good, if he's accurate, because he's not a neuroscientist. He's a humanities scholar. He's a Buddhism scholar. And so
Yeah.
I think it's worth asking if he's giving justice to these issues of neuroscience and understanding the concept of self in those fields today, with or without Buddhism.
Yeah. Yeah, I will clarify there. He is a cognitive scientist, but you're right in that he doesn't specifically study neuroscience, and I'm not cognitive science, I'm sure definitely fits squarely in between like
Mhm.
hard science and the humanities because it's not scientistic. Some cognitive scientists are. Um, but yeah, no, that's a very good question. So he mentions this guy Ulrich Ness Nasser, was apparently the father of cognitive psychology, and that's pretty cool. And he mentioned these different kinds of self-knowledge that that Nasser, yeah, I guess he came up with them. And it's the ecological self, the interpersonal self, the extended self, the private self, and the conceptual self. And I think that in order to understand why he does this, it's important to acknowledge his emphasis on experience and on phenomenology. He's a very there's a very strong overarching emergentist perspective to all of this, and he invokes that here with Nasser. I've never heard of him. I'll have to read him more, but um, yeah. So what I wrote in response to all this, because he proposes again this book is in response to this guy Robert Wright's book, who does
Mhm.
is kind of making the quintessential Buddhist modernist argument in his own book, Why Buddhism is True. And to support his own argument, he invokes what's called the modular view of the mind. And it's this idea that the brain has um, specific networks and regions that are referred to as modules, and they're responsible for different things. So, you have your, I don't know, like your social conversation module. You have your creative module. Like you have different um, modules of the brain, and Thompson is very critical of this, and I can understand why, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the mindfulness. I think it's called Mindfulness Mania
Yeah.
chapter, where that's the one where he focuses a lot of his criticisms against this like um kind of quasi like conciliant like neuroscience and Buddhism argument. But what I said in response to this like invocation of Nasser and his like, different selves is, how is this different than the modular view of the mind? Like to
Yeah.
me, the only thing that differs here is that we're using the word self instead of module. Um,
Right.
and and again, I agree in the sense that I think there is a certain level of pedantry here, because if he wants to invoke, and again, I think he's doing it to sway more towards this emergentist view of the mind, which I agree with, which I am very sympathetic to. Um, but I I don't really see how that would be useful, um, because it seems like he's saying the exact same thing, just with, um, kind of like phenomenological terminology, or this guy's phenomenological terminology. So
Another important point about that, and I'm glad that you brought up, is that this is a point where I think that um, this guy that he's quoted, and also Evan Thompson himself, is sliding away from neuroscience and cognitive science and sliding into philosophy. I know that cognitive science touches philosophy, and I know that that's an important part of it. But
Mhm.
at what point are you looking at the science of consciousness? And at what point are you basically describing the various ways that one might be able to describe a person? And
Yeah.
that's one of the issues I take with this cognitive psychology use of these different selves,
Mhm.
name here, self, name here, self, name here, self. Those might be useful in a therapy context where you want to identify a problem. Someone says, I'm not having a problem with my social self, my interpersonal self. I'm having a problem in my internal self or my ecological self or something like that, whatever. But I don't think that it's a useful way to sort of understand what scientific evidence there is about the brain. And I don't think it's a useful way to make claims about what we would see if we had better technology or a better understanding or what have you in the scientific field. I don't think it's a useful contribution either to really bring it up.
Gotcha. Okay. That's really interesting. And I'll kind of answer your earlier question because um so have you heard of the three body problem?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll articulate that. So if you don't know, there's a book and now a Netflix series by this title. And it's the three body problem, and it refers to a problem in physics where if you have three celestial bodies that are of relatively equal mass and you put them in motion, um, their gravity is essentially the trajectory of their motion is essentially incalculable,
Mm-hmm.
because the complexity of the motions, like in correlation with one another, is so chaotic and so entropic that there's really
There's no
no.
math to describe it.
Yeah, yeah. And I I think it's an excellent analogy for the mind. Um, the three body problem, that's only focusing on three factors, and I guess gravity and, other forces that maybe I'm not aware of. Um, Imagine how I think the amount of factors that can play into any behavioral mental phenomenon are truly infinite. And if not truly infinite, then effectively infinite, in the sense that, let's say you're doing some sort of psychology test for, I don't know, like empathy or whatever, and you want to test like, hey, let's just hypothetically, does this medicine make people feel more empathetic or whatever? Or less depressed. That's an easier one. Um, and then you look at, does the medicine work? Do people feel better? Do people feel happier? Do people feel less depressed? Um, that medicine could be among those factors. So too could, something that you heard on the train that morning. So too could something that you saw on your news feed scrolling through your phone 4 weeks ago. So too could be, you think that the therapist or the person giving you the medicine and asking you the questions looks like your mom a little bit. So maybe, you bring in these um, repressed emotions of like a strong, like, I think there are so many factors that are so utterly salient to our conscious experience that we're not even aware of,
Mm-hmm.
um, because we are such because we're such complex creatures, that I think that even if we did have better technology and could really, really dig in there and see what's going on at the physical level, I don't think we'll ever have um, something that can extrapolate very concrete data about our mental lives and with any sort of like substantial predictive power, because that's just how um, complex the situation is. And this is something where I really do appreciate Thompson here actually is his notion of the self as being extended. And I don't know. I guess I'm curious if you have some common ground there. Almost just in the sense that like he's saying like no, the mind isn't here, and it's Buddhism isn't saying that the mind is like only in the brain. Obviously you but yeah, in the sense that the mind is my interaction with you, my interaction with the walls of this room, my hearing, my unconscious, like it's so far beyond the limitations of, I guess, the standard scientific view of the brain. um I don't know how well I articulated that, but what do you kind of think there?
No, you did very well. I think that that's a good analogy for understanding it. The instead of the three body problem, it's like the, 400 trillion body problem or something like, I don't know, some huge number. Um, so the question is, yeah, do I understand the self as extended beyond just the limits of the skull, so to speak? And the answer is absolutely yes. Yes, I think that one of the shortcomings of the branch of neuroscience that attempts to make prescriptive or descriptive claims about consciousness or about selfhood or about, the experience of human beings. One of the limitations is that when they are studying brains, they're just studying brains. you know, they're I think that neuroscience is important as a branch of medicine, but I think that it's not going to be enough to study self. I think that self is a matter of brain, it's a matter of body, it's a matter of past, present, and future. It's a matter of the limits of this physical body plus those limits being breached by the outside world and by all my interactions with everything and everyone in it. And it's
Mm,
also a matter of understanding not just me, the organism, but also the organisms on my skin and inside my body, the bacteria and the viruses that and the parasites and the undue passengers I have, that are involved in my body processes. So I agree that it's an infinitely complicated issue. And I don't think that infinite technology would be able to even still accurately capture it all. And where I go with this is usually to um, a pretty good friend of mine that I made during my thesis. His name is Imanishi Kinji, and he's been dead for a very long time. And he wrote in the 1930s through the 1970s about his understanding of the body or the self or the person as an ecological entity. He wanted to really make sense of this issue of living versus non living. That was kind of what was going on in Japanese science at the time. What is
mm,
biotic and what is abiotic? Because that's a very relevant question for ecology and for physics and for science and medicine and biology and stuff. So it's important we know these things.
yeah.
How do we say something's actually living? It's important that I note that this conversation that I'm talking about predates the discovery of DNA. So there
Mm,
is no concept of the mechanism by which things that are living replicate themselves.
right.
Um, but so he says that human beings are living, of course, but they are aggregations of non-living components into a living thing. So that must mean that non-living things can aggregate into a living thing. So bacteria, viruses, people, animals, they're all made of physics, components of physics, matter. They're made of elements that themselves are not living. They are basically big, large chemical reactions. But because we have this abiotic component to ourselves, that means that we have continuity between us and the environment around us. So we have a very real, very like tangible continuity between me and the chair I'm sitting on and the table that I'm sitting at. just because I can touch these things doesn't mean that there's a separation between them and me. There's a oneness, a singularity, so to speak, a unitariness between me and everything around me, as as an amalgamation of non-living things into a living thing, whereas everything around me, except for other organisms, is just non-living stuff that has the potential to be living stuff. This is all very
Right.
colored by Kyoto school philosophy, which understands the oneness of pure experience, right? So there's this idea um, of reality that describes it as a singular pure experience. We don't need to get into that, but it basically is how I understand the self. This idea of um, the continuity between me and everything around me, the oneness and the interchange and the exchange and the interplay between me and everyone else and everything else. And in that way, self is universal, so to speak, at least small s self, because I already said I'm convinced by, you know, non-self with a big S. So
Yeah.
small s self is everythingness, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah. I was just gonna ask you that actually. And then I had one more question after that. Kind of going back to Yogacara. But I'm just writing it out so I don't forget. Um, so there is this notion of oneness that comes from Buddhism, but maybe that's a misinterpretation. I'm not sure. And then there's also non-self. Um, how would you, I guess, like bridge those? Um, the first thing that comes to mind for me is dependent origination, Indra's net, in the sense that like everything's connected, but I guess maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that like karma doesn't happen just because everything is like connected. I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. That just popped up in my head.
No, that's a good question about the issue of like monism, as they call it, from like the Latin of mono for one.
Mm,
Um, the issue of monism is fascinating in relation to Buddhism because textually, Buddhism is not monist. It's anti-monist, so to speak.
mm,
But there are some Buddhist philosophers who are monists, and they sometimes use Buddhism to make monist arguments. And I think that's a fascinating move. I think that's a bold move, and I think that it's a radical move in its own way. Um, it's an important issue, actually, with regards to Thompson, since we're supposed to be talking about chapter 3 of Thompson. Um,
yeah, yeah.
it's an issue with regard to Thompson because um, Buddhist modernists often think in terms of this monism, and they think that Buddhism implies monism. My issue with monism in the Western context is that it is a reformulated Protestant Christian morality. So I've heard an interesting argument out there by a historian of Christianity, and his argument is that the spirituality movement, the New Age movement, the secular religion movement, it is a response to misgivings that are founded for Protestant Christianity, right? They're against the issue of a God that nobody can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear. They're against this issue of homophobia. They're against this issue of indoctrination. There's plenty of issues that they have. And what they do in response is they replace the word God with the universe or with something else like that, but they still interact with it and engage with it linguistically and emotionally in Protestant ethical terms. So instead of saying, you did something bad and something happened to you, God got you back, they say the universe got you back.
Mm,
The universe says that's not going to happen. This is something that we say whenever we get rejected from grad school or we get accepted into something else. The universe said no today. The universe said it wasn't meant to be or whatever. This
mm.
is just a reformulation of Protestant morality, ethics, causality, cosmology, but instead of saying capital G God, we say universe. And
Okay.
this factors into monism. I kind of believe that spirituality is this like inherited neo-Protestant sort of or spiritualism, I should say, is this inherited neo-Protestant thing. But when it
Hmm.
comes to
At
the
least in like
idea
the
of
West.
in the West, yeah,
Okay.
when it comes to monism, this is central. This is what's going on. Monism is this idea of there being a universal oneness, and it has roots in Hinduism, like in this Brahmanical tradition that we've talked about. But
Hmm.
um, it's this issue of thinking that we are all part of a singular whole, either our consciousnesses or our spirits or our souls or whatever you like to say. And the Buddha really puts that down often because he says, no, there is no everlasting, unchanging something. There is no everlasting, unchanging something anywhere ever. Stop
Hmm.
saying that there's only one. Stop saying that there's many. Stop saying that there is any such thing at all because there is no such thing. And so he really puts down monism. But then you get these Kyoto school philosophers later on in history in the 19th and 20th century. And in particular, I'm thinking of Nishida Kitaro, who I made use of in my master's thesis and who is probably the premier in the English language, the premier Kyoto school philosopher, named for being a philosopher who worked at Kyoto University. And he is, in a sense, a monist because he thinks that reality is that which precludes the subject object distinction. And he uses a lot of Buddhist arguments and a lot of Buddhist texts to make that argument, especially whenever this relates to how his monism and how his understanding of reality factors into morality and living morally. And I think that it's kind of fascinating because I don't agree with it, but I can't really figure out why just based on what he's written. You know what I mean? Like I can say,
Yeah.
of course, the Buddha put down monism and you're doing monism and that's a bad thing. But that's not enough for me to like pull apart his argument and say it's wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that
No,
like he makes a good claim.
yeah, we could totally talk about him in a future episode. I kind of wanted to wrap up with one other question that I had, but is he the like he's kind of known for like bridging like Eastern religion and Western religion? Like is that his thing or am I thinking of someone
Yeah,
else?
yeah, he's definitely played a huge role in that as well. He's a
Okay.
prolific scholar, so if you can think of it, he's probably done it.
Yeah, okay, cool. If he's the guy that I'm thinking of, we should definitely do an episode on him because that would be very cool.
And you know,
And
one of his
that's
disciples is DT Suzuki, who is also he's responsible, so to speak, for bringing Japanese Zen to the United States. So
gotcha.
that's actually Nishida Kitaro is one of his strong influences, DT
Okay.
Suzuki's. So we should definitely get into that lineage sometime. It'd be very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, okay, cool. So I wanted to ask this final question. So you were talking earlier about how there's some debate, but largely, at least from your own perspective, it seems like idealism and solipsism, these notions would be kind of a false equivalency with Yogacara doctrine, at least the Yogacara doctrine that we were relying on earlier. Um, what do you think about panpsychism? And if I could elaborate on that a little bit more, it's basically saying it's a recent Western philosophical movement that says that physical matter and physical reality is itself in some way conscious, um, and that is what accounts for. I think you mentioned earlier, like uh, how do we consider something alive? How do we consider something sentient or whatever? And there's many different schools that and many different ways that panpsychists go about that, but their their ultimate conclusion is reality is itself conscious in some way. Physical matter is itself conscious in some way. Um, what, yeah, how would Buddhism in general and then Yogacara in particular respond to that? How ameliorable do you think it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for explaining it because I had never heard of this. Um,
Hmm.
the idea that reality itself, even the abiotic stuff, is conscious. I think it's very fascinating. I think that that is very similar to the Buddha nature view and the esoteric Buddhist view of the world. So the Buddha nature view is that sentient beings all have this Buddha nature, but another sort of stage of its development is that even non-living, non-sentient things have Buddha nature because through those things we can come to understand the Dharma. For example, like I said, if you leave a lunch meat on the counter for 4 hours, it goes from being food to not being food. And so I've observed this non-living thing, and now I understand impermanence, right? That's sort of an example of coming to know the Dharma from experience, from observing and understanding a non-living thing. Um, I think there's an important difference between two things that you said. So one thing you said is non-living things are sentient in their own way.
Mhm.
And in the esoteric point of view, that the entire world is the Dharmakaya of Vairocana, and that we are all sort of words in his spoken, preached sermon, his Dharma, that he preaches to himself for his own enjoyment. In that respect, yes, even the non-living things are his words and are part of his Dharmakaya, and so are, in that sense, manifestations of or sort of projections of Vairocana, who is a sentient being. Um,
The Shingon view, right?
the Shingon view, that's right.
Okay, cool.
This is interesting because non-living stuff being sentient and reality being conscious and sentient, that's a big difference. That's a huge difference. Reality being conscious, reality being sentient implies monism, and that the one, the capital O one, is conscious, is knowledgeable. That's similar to the esoteric view as well, but the esoteric Shingon view is not monist. And also, it doesn't understand reality as being God. It doesn't, the implication of reality being conscious is that it is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And Vairocana is not necessarily those things in the Shingon view. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. In the aspect of mind only doctrine, Alaya Vijnana doctrine, that's only a piece of the story. So it can't really speak to the issue of whether or not living and non-living things are all sentient or not. Mind only doctrine needs to be put next to something else in order for it to be completed. So there are people who are mind only Buddhists, but they are against the idea of Buddha nature. They think that Buddha nature is completely incompatible. Or there are those that think that it is compatible and that the Alaya Vijnana is Buddha nature itself. Um, Similarly, there's esoteric mind only people who think that, um, that which the mind projects onto for us to have our day-to-day experiences, that which is perfumed, is not a blank screen. It's actually Vairocana himself. So
Mhm.
it needs to be put together. My personal favorite doctrines, the ones that I'm the most convinced by, are in part this esoteric one that all of reality is Vairocana, and also in part this Buddha nature one that we all have Buddha nature and that it's only a matter of time for all of us, even if that time is basically infinitely long, um, until we become Buddhas. So, in that sense, my own view would be, yeah, I am kind of convinced that Buddhism would suggest that non-living things have Dharma nature and are expounding the Dharma to us at all times, and we just need to look at it correctly to see that. Um,
Mm,
does that imply that all reality is conscious? I'm not so sure. I think so.
okay.
That's kind of a complicated way, and it's a very personal way of kind of answering the question.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that though, because I'll say it as many times as I have to. It's Turner, who is our other friend, is very much a Yogacara guy, and if I'm correct, is quite against the view of Buddha nature, just with respect
Yes.
to the Yogacara doctrine. And then you're very influenced by Shingon Buddhism, which very much relies on. I mean, Kukai is very explicit that all sentient beings, if I'm not mistaken, have Buddha nature.
And non-sentient too.
Okay, interesting. That is a very yeah, that's very cool. I should read him again. Um, the last thing that I was gonna say, could you could you speak, I guess like one last time, this isn't maybe on the topic of non-self anymore, but um, what is how does, I guess, Mahavairochana play into Buddhist Shingon Buddhist cosmology? Like what does it say about what the universe is and what reality is? What's the Shingon assessment there?
Yeah. So what I'm about to tell you is kind of, it's actually a secret. So Shingon, as we've talked about, is initiatory. You have to be initiated, and these initiation processes involve official transmissions of parts of the secret until you reach a level where you have sort of been told the whole thing all at once. But thank you to Kukai, he has opened the lid on it all. So it's a secret with the trappings and the sort of the imagination of secret by those around it, but it's an open secret. So you can actually see in and talk about it. You can actually read about it and come to understand it. You can come to study it, and you're not actually sort of doing anything so wrong as, you know, poking in where you're not, where you don't belong, poking in into someone's private stuff, right? It's not like that at all. So it's the
Okay.
secret. Yeah. He kind of, I've heard it argued that he democratized the secret. And I think that that's a good way to look at it. So
Yeah.
in Shingon Buddhism, the cosmology is, and one of the reasons why I love Shingon Buddhism and Shingon art and iconography is because of this cosmology. It's so fundamentally different from any other Buddhist cosmology ever. And what I'm talking about when I say Shingon Buddhist cosmology is the cosmology that is synthesized from Indian, Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese cosmologies all in one. And that's one of the reasons it's so very unique, is because it is so synthetic, but it's also unique because it starts from a different origin point than the historical Buddha himself. So whenever the historical Buddha Shakyamuni was asked, what is the origin of the universe and what is its end? He didn't answer that question. Famously, he's like, don't ask. That's not worth worrying about. You know, we don't speak to stuff like that here. He didn't comment on it. So that means that all of these different schools of Buddhism are left to come up with various answers to that question themselves. And they do. I mean, we can make believe and we can say Buddhists don't care about that, but they absolutely do. They absolutely do care about the nature, origin, and terminus of the universe. So in Shingon Buddhism, the root of the cosmology is the Sanskrit syllable A. It's the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet. It's the first letter of the English alphabet. And according to that, according to Shingon, the first letter is the sound that a person or any organism with a mouth makes when they make to speak before they change their mouth to make a different sound. So the buzzing of vocal cords before you change your mouth and throat to make them into different letters and vowels and consonants is ah. And that is the secret to all of reality as we experience and understand it. We talked about string theory and how things vibrate into the matter that we see ourselves. This is something where people have looked to Shingon Buddhism and been like, oh, yeah, it believes in Shingon and string theory too, right? That's just as problematic as any other time that that happens. But essentially, they're saying that the vibrations that we see all around us into the different kinds of matter that we all are and experience, all of these are ah, the vibration ah. And if you become enlightened, you can hear it, you can participate in it, you can understand it. And who is saying it? Well, Vairocana. He's the one who's saying ah. And through his dharma, through his,
Vairochana?
what's that?
Who is Vairochana?
Vairocana is the cosmic Buddha, and in Shingon, he's everything, right? So, speaking to this syllable, all of the world as we understand it is the vibration ah, and so therefore that's like the most subtle, most magical, most important sound, the most important, powerful sound. This is all described in Kukai. if you can read his works in translation. Hakeda Yoshito has a um, good set of translations for his major works for those out there who want to hear or read some of that. Anyways, the ah syllable is very important. And also simultaneously, we're talking about Vairocana's Dharmakaya, his Dharma body. All of the universe differentiates according to this ah syllable, but it exists because of this Dharmakaya. It is this Dharmakaya. Whenever we say Dharma body, we mean something similar to corpus or body of work, as we would use that in English. Whenever we refer to somebody's life's work of literature, we say their corpus, their body of literature. And that's what we're talking about here, a somaticity of the Dharma. So the physical body of the Dharma is Vairocana, and it is vibrating ah, and it is all of us and everything in the whole universe. And so, in that sense, he's like the matter of the universe, but he's also the idea of the universe. He's also the word of the universe. So he's the referent, the referenced, and the idea of referent and reference in the first place. So the world then is composed of this Dharma world text, Dharma hyphen world hyphen text. And we are all letters and words in that text. And for us to be that way, before there's any differentiation, there must be ah, right? Because I said like before, but whenever you say a word, the first thing you have to do is buzz the vocal cords and make ah. So too does Vairocana. And that's how everything differentiates into us, into what we are. And that's true even of other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So this is very important. In Shingon Buddhism, they think that Shakyamuni and Avalokiteshvara and Samantabhadra and all these other bodhisattvas and Buddhas, Amida, that we know of, these are all manifestations of different aspects or dimensions of Vairocana's Dharma body. And the claim they make to kind of assert that is very interesting. You say, how? Why? How does that work? And they say, go look in the sutras. Those people are named. Shakyamuni is named in the sutra, and the sutra is Vairocana's Dharma. It's his body of Dharma, and these people are named in it. So they're all manifestations of him, just like you're a manifestation of him. It's cool. I think it's fun. We all are named in the sutras because the sutras say all sentient beings, and that's us, right? So
Yeah.
by that argument, by the completeness of the text, and by the fact that the text is the Dharma body of Vairocana, we are all not different, not distinct from Vairocana himself. I think it's a cool cosmology, and I'm inclined to believe it just on the grounds of its argumentative structure and on the grounds of thinking that it's cool as hell.
Yeah, all right. We're doing it. We're doing an episode on Kukai and Shingon and
Yes, yes, let's do
really
it.
into that stuff in another episode. I wholeheartedly agree. I have a lot to say about Kukai. Again, I'm only left with the echoes of the things that I have read and studied previously, but he has had a very profound impact on my thinking in ways that I probably still carry now and don't even realize. But very cool cosmology, and we'll have to talk about that more in depth. But I think that, you know, we've strayed from the non-self discussion is maybe let's wrap up.
Yeah,
It's been a
let's do.
while, but it's been a very fun conversation.
Yeah, it has.
It's yeah, this I think this is my favorite episode so far. Just because we got to, you know, really riff off each other with all these very cool ideas. Did you have anything that you wanted to add before we close?
Just to say, I'm glad that you had me on. I enjoyed the conversation a lot. And for all my misgivings with this chapter, I enjoyed reading it a lot. And I have read chapter 4 before also. I'm going to reread it before our next episode. And let me just say, in case Evan Thompson's out there listening, don't worry. I'm not as upset about that chapter as I was about this one. I like that one a lot better, and I have more agreements than disagreements with that one. So I will let you off the hook there. So that's
Awesome.
good. But yeah, thanks for having me on. And if you made it this far into the episode and are still listening, thank you for still listening as well.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. And you can find Nick's podcast, Bright on Buddhism, on all platforms now, I
Yeah,
believe.
even YouTube now.
Even YouTube. Awesome. So if you want to check out his stuff, definitely do. There's a lot of really cool and interesting stuff there. Nick, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. I hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, and we'll catch you next time.